Hello, dear friends, and welcome to Sleep Stories TV. Tonight, in our Greek mythology series, we embark on The Odyssey, a 10-year journey home. Odysseus, lost to the seas, battles gods and monsters, his heart anchored to Ithaca. If you haven't subscribed to Sleep Stories TV, join us now. Hit that bell and don't miss a tale. Now let's sail into the myth where courage rises and home calls. Nearly 20 years had passed since Odysseus left his homeland of Ithaca, and while many believed him dead, our hero was stranded on a paradise island, a prisoner of love. The island of Ogygia, lush with emerald groves and kissed by the ceaseless rhythm of turquoise waves, was a gilded cage. Calypso, the divine nymph whose beauty could rival the stars, had ensnared him with her enchantments, her voice a melody that promised eternal youth and pleasures unending. For 7 years, Odysseus lingered in her embrace, his days bathed in the golden light of her affection, his nights haunted by the ache of a distant shore. Ithaca, his rugged, wind-swept home, called to him in dreams, its rocky cliffs and olive groves sharper in memory than the paradise before him. His heart, though warmed by Calypso's touch, was tethered to a life left behind, to Penelope, his steadfast wife, whose face he traced in the constellations above. To Telemachus, his son now grown without a father's hand to guide him. To the kingdom that had once bent to his will. The world beyond Ogygia believed him lost, a casualty of the Trojan War's endless aftermath. His name whispered only in elegies by those who mourned. Yet Odysseus, the man of twists and turns, was not dead, but bound, his spirit caught between the lure of immortality and the mortal longing for home. Each dawn he stood at the island's edge, gazing across the endless sea, its vastness a mirror to his isolation. The waves spoke to him in their ceaseless churn, whispering of trials endured and those yet to come. He had sailed from Troy a decade ago, his ships laden with spoils, and men their hearts buoyant with victory. But the gods, fickle and vengeful, had turned the journey home into a labyrinth of suffering. Storms had shattered his fleet, monsters had devoured his companions, and temptations had tested his resolve. Now here on Ogygia, time itself seemed to pause, as if the gods had woven a spell to hold him in stasis. Calypso, with her divine allure, offered him a life free from pain, from death, from the frailties of mortal flesh. She would make him a god, she promised, her eyes gleaming with the weight of eternity. But Odysseus, whose cunning had outwitted kings and beasts, could not surrender his soul to her. To be a god was to forsake Ithaca, to erase the calloused hands that had built a kingdom, the heart that beat for a mortal woman, the legacy of a son he barely knew. His refusal was not born of pride, but of a deeper truth. Home was not merely a place, but a tapestry of bonds woven with love, duty, and sacrifice. He thought of Penelope, her clever mind, and unwavering loyalty holding the throne against the chaos of his absence. He imagined Telemachus, a boy no longer standing on the cusp of manhood, perhaps questioning the father who had become a myth. The pain of their distance gnawed at him sharper than any wound from battle. Calypso, sensing his unrest, would sit beside him, her voice soft as the breeze urging him to let go of the past. "Why suffer for a world that has forgotten you?" she would ask, her fingers brushing his arm, her gaze a pool of divine persuasion. But Odysseus, the man of many ways, would turn his eyes back to the sea, his silence a rebellion against her charms. He was no stranger to temptation. He had faced sirens and sorceresses, each one a test of his will. Yet Calypso's offer was the most seductive, for it promised peace at the cost of everything he held dear. The years on Ogygia blurred into a dreamlike haze each day, a repetition of beauty and longing. He built a small altar of stones by the shore, an offering to the gods who seemed to have forsaken him. He prayed to Athena, his divine protector, whose wisdom had guided him through the fires of Troy. He whispered to Hermes, the messenger, begging for deliverance. And he called to Zeus, king of the gods, whose will could bend the tides of fate. His prayers were not for glory or power, but for a single humble wish to stand once more on Ithaca's soil, to breathe its air, to reclaim his place among the living. The gods, however, were silent, their counsels hidden behind the veil of Olympus. Calypso, ever watchful, saw the fire in his eyes dim but never extinguish. She knew his heart was not hers to keep, yet her love, both selfish and sincere, held him fast. She wove spells to soothe his pain, sang songs to dull his memories. But Odysseus, the wanderer, could not be tamed. In the quiet moments when the island slept under a blanket of stars, Odysseus would recount his journey to himself as if to keep it alive. He spoke of the Cyclops, whose single eye he had blinded with cunning, of Circe, whose magic had tested his humanity, of the underworld, where shades of the dead had whispered prophecies of his return. Each tale was a thread in the tapestry of his survival, a testament to his resilience. But Ogygia was different. Here there were no monsters to slay, no storms to outwit, only the slow, seductive pull of surrender. He wondered if this was his final trial, a test not of strength or intellect, but of faith in the life he had left behind. The thought of Penelope weaving her own defiance against the suitors who plagued their home gave him strength. She too was a warrior, her battlefield one of patience and guile. Together, they were bound by a love that defied time, distance, and the will of gods. As the 20th year of his absence loomed, a shift stirred in the air. The sea grew restless, its waves carrying whispers of change. Odysseus felt it in his bones, a spark of hope that had long been buried. Perhaps Athena had heard his prayers, or Zeus had grown weary of his exile. Perhaps the fates in their inscrutable dance had decided it was time for the hero to return. On Ogygia, the days of captivity were numbered, though Odysseus could not yet know it. His heart, ever fixed on Ithaca, beat with a quiet resolve. He was a man of many names, hero, wanderer, king, but above all, he was a man who longed for home. The paradise of Ogygia, for all its beauty, was a shadow compared to the rugged cliffs of his island, the laughter of his son, the embrace of his queen. And so he waited, his eyes on the horizon, ready for the moment when the gods would set him free. Meanwhile, in Ithaca, his palace had been overrun by arrogant suitors who were consuming his wealth day and night and forcing his wife, Queen Penelope, to remarry. The once proud halls of Odysseus's home, built with the strength of his hands and the vision of his heart, had become a battleground of greed and insolence. For years, the suitors, nobles, and princes from Ithaca and beyond had descended like vultures, each one eager to claim the throne and the hand of the queen. They lounged in the great hall, their laughter coarse and mocking, as they feasted on Odysseus's livestock, drained his wine stores, and squandered the riches of a kingdom left leaderless. Servants once loyal to their absent king scurried under the weight of their demands, their faces etched with fear and resentment. The air was thick with the scent of roasted meat and spilled wine, a grotesque parody of the feasts Odysseus had once hosted, where hospitality was a sacred bond. Now the suitors' presence was a violation, their every act, a desecration of the home Odysseus had left behind nearly 2 decades ago. Penelope, the queen, whose beauty and wisdom matched her husband's, stood as the last bastion against this chaos. Her heart, though heavy with grief for her lost love, burned with a quiet defiance. She moved through the palace like a shadow, her steps measured, her eyes sharp with the cunning that had kept her free. The suitors pressed her daily, their voices dripping with false charm or outright threats, demanding she choose a new husband. They believed Odysseus dead, his bones lost to the sea or some distant battlefield, and saw Ithaca as a prize ripe for the taking. But Penelope, whose love for Odysseus was as unyielding as the cliffs of their island refused to yield. She wove a delicate web of delay her mind, as sharp as the loom she worked by day. For 3 years she promised to choose a suitor, once she completed a burial shroud for Laertes Odysseus's aging father. Each night under the flicker of oil lamps, she unraveled her day's work thread, by painstaking thread, a secret act of resistance that kept the suitors at bay. Her hands calloused from the loom were her weapons, her patience a shield against their impatience. Telemachus, now a young man of 20, watched this slow siege with a heart torn between rage and helplessness. He had grown up in the shadow of his father's legend, hearing tales of Odysseus's courage, his cunning, his triumphs at Troy. Yet the man himself was a ghost, a figure woven from stories told by old warriors and loyal servants. Telemachus's memories of his father were faint, a strong hand lifting him, a deep voice promising return, but they fueled his resolve. The suitors mocked him, calling him a boy, unfit to rule their jeers, a constant reminder of his powerlessness. They sprawled across his father's throne, their boots scuffing the stone floors, their hands plundering the wealth that should have been his inheritance. Yet Telemachus, guided by his mother's strength and the faint hope that his father lived, began to stir. He was no longer the child who hid behind Penelope's skirts. He was a prince, and the blood of Odysseus ran through him. In quiet moments he slipped away to the cliffs, staring at the sea, as his father once had, praying for a sign, for a ship, for the return of the man who could restore order. The palace itself seemed to mourn its master's absence. The walls, once alive with the laughter of feasts and the music of bards, now echoed with the suitors' raucous demands. The great hearth, where Odysseus had once offered sacrifices to the gods, burned low, its flames struggling against the weight of neglect. The loyal retainers. Eumaeus the swineherd, Eurycleia the nursemaid, who had raised Odysseus, moved through their duties with heavy hearts. Their loyalty to their king unbroken, but tested by the suitors' cruelty. Eumaeus, tending pigs in the hills, whispered tales of Odysseus to the stars, refusing to believe his king was gone. Eurycleia, her hands wrinkled with age, guarded Telemachus as fiercely as she had guarded his father, her eyes scanning the horizon for a sail. Yet there were others, servants swayed by fear or greed, who betrayed their master's memory, serving the suitors with false smiles, their whispers feeding the chaos. Penelope's burden was not only the suitors, but the weight of uncertainty. Each day she faced the same question: was Odysseus alive, or had the gods claimed him? Her dreams were haunted by visions of him storm-tossed on a raging sea, or standing triumphant on a distant shore. But no messenger brought word, no oracle offered clarity. She clung to hope, fragile as a thread, yet strong enough to sustain her. Her beauty, though softened by years of worry, still drew the suitors' gaze, but it was her mind they could not conquer. She played their game, offering smiles that hid her contempt, engaging in banter that masked her resolve. To the suitors, she was a prize. To herself, she was a queen, guarding her husband's legacy with every breath. She taught Telemachus to navigate this treacherous court, whispering lessons of patience and strategy, preparing him for the day he might need to fight. The suitors, blind to her cunning, grew bolder with each passing year. Antinous, their leader, was the worst, a man whose arrogance was matched only by his cruelty. He strutted through the palace as if it were his own, his voice cutting through the din to demand more wine, more meat, more time. Eurymachus, smoother, but no less vile, used honeyed words to mask his ambition. His eyes lingering on Penelope with a hunger that made her skin crawl. They spoke of Odysseus as a faded memory, a king who had failed to return unworthy of their respect. Their presence was a wound to Ithaca, draining its resources, eroding its spirit. The island itself seemed to wither under their greed, its fields less bountiful, its people more divided. Yet in the hearts of the faithful, Penelope, Telemachus, Eumaeus, Euryclea, a spark remained, a belief that the gods would not abandon their king. As the 20th year of Odysseus's absence dawned, a restlessness stirred in Ithaca. Rumors reached the palace, whispers of a man washed ashore in distant lands, of a hero who still defied the gods' wrath. Penelope, hearing these tales, dared not hope too fiercely, but her heart quickened. Telemachus, emboldened by his mother's strength, began to seek answers, questioning travelers and sailors who docked at Ithaca's shores. The suitors, oblivious to the shifting tides, continued their revelry, unaware that the gods were watching. On Mount Olympus, Athena, the gray-eyed goddess who had never forsaken Odysseus, was weaving a plan. The palace, steeped in chaos, stood on the edge of change, its fate tied to a man who was even now gazing at the same sea from a distant island. The threads of destiny, long tangled, were beginning to unravel, and Ithaca waited, its heart beating for the return of its king. On Mount Olympus, the goddess Athena, Odysseus's faithful protector, pleaded with Zeus to intervene, and so the wheels of fate finally began to turn again. High above the mortal world, where clouds wreathed the peaks in an eternal dance of mist and light, the gods gathered in their radiant hall, their voices echoing like thunder across the heavens. Athena, her gray eyes blazing with purpose, stood before Zeus, king of the gods, her words sharp with conviction. For nearly a decade she had watched her favored mortal languish on Calypso's island, his spirit bound by divine enchantment, his heart aching for Ithaca. Odysseus, the man of twists and turns, whose cunning had won her admiration in the fires of Troy, was no ordinary soul. He was a hero forged in hardship, his mind a labyrinth of strategy, his will a flame that even the gods could not extinguish. Athena, goddess of wisdom and war, had guided him through battles and storms, her divine hand shielding him from the worst of fate's cruelties. Now she could bear his exile no longer. Her voice, clear as a bell across the celestial council, carried the weight of justice and compassion, urging Zeus to free the man who had suffered enough. The hall of Olympus shimmered with divine splendor, its golden columns catching the light of an eternal sun. The gods, immortal and capricious, lounged on thrones of cloud and star, their gazes shifting between indifference and intrigue. Poseidon, the sea god, his trident gleaming with the power of tempests, glowered at Athena's plea. His grudge against Odysseus was a wound unhealed born of the blinding of his son, the Cyclops Polyphemus. Poseidon's wrath had churned the seas against the hero, scattering his ships, drowning his men, and prolonging his journey with relentless fury. Yet even he, mighty as he was, could not defy the will of Zeus forever. Athena, undeterred by Poseidon's scowl, wove her argument, with the precision of a loom, her words threading through the council's murmurs. She spoke of Odysseus's trials, the monsters he had faced, the temptations he had resisted, the loyalty he had shown to his family and his gods. She reminded Zeus of the hero's offerings, the sacrifices burned in his name, the prayers whispered on distant shores. Has he not paid the price of mortal pride? She asked, her voice rising like a tide. Has he not earned the chance to return to the home he loves? Zeus, his beard white as the peaks of Olympus, his eyes holding the weight of eternity, listened in silence. The king of the gods was no stranger to the conflicts of his divine kin, their feuds as vast as the skies. He had watched Odysseus's journey with a detached curiosity, noting the hero's resilience, his refusal to break under the weight of divine caprice. Athena's plea stirred something in him, a recognition perhaps that even gods must honor the endurance of a mortal soul. He raised his hand, and the hall fell silent, the air thick with anticipation, his voice deep as the roots of the earth rolled through the chamber. "Let the man be freed," he declared, his words a decree that bound the fates. "Calypso shall release him, and his path home shall be cleared, though not without trial. Poseidon's wrath may linger, but the will of Zeus is final." Athena's heart lifted, though she hid her triumph behind a mask of solemnity. She knew the journey would not be easy. Odysseus's trials were far from over, but the command of Zeus was a spark that would set the hero's destiny in motion once more. Below on the mortal plane, the world felt the ripple of this divine decision. On Ogygia, the winds shifted, carrying a new note, sharp and urgent. Calypso, her senses attuned to the whispers of Olympus, felt the weight of Zeus's will descend upon her. Her heart, though divine, ached at the thought of losing Odysseus, the mortal who had stirred her immortal soul. She walked to the shore where he stood, his eyes fixed on the horizon, his silhouette a study in longing. "The gods have spoken," she said, her voice soft, but heavy with resignation. "You are to leave me to return to your Ithaca." Odysseus turned his face a map of hope and sorrow, his eyes searching hers for truth. She told him of Hermes, the messenger god, who would soon arrive to enforce Zeus's command. She offered to aid him to provide the tools to build a raft, to stock it with provisions for the journey. Her love, though it bound him, was not cruel. She would not defy the king of the gods, nor would she let Odysseus depart unprepared. On Ithaca, the air grew restless, as if the island itself sensed the turning of fate. Penelope, weaving her endless shroud, paused at her loom, her hands trembling with a hope she dared not name. Telemachus, standing on the cliffs, felt a strange certainty settle in his chest, as if the sea itself whispered of his father's return. The suitors, oblivious, continued their revelry, their laughter a hollow echo in a palace that yearned for its king. Athena, ever watchful, descended from Olympus in secret, her form cloaked in mortal guise. She moved among the people of Ithaca, planting seeds of courage in Telemachus's heart, whispering strength to Penelope's resolve. She knew Odysseus's return would not be a simple homecoming. It would be a reckoning, a restoration of order through cunning and blood. The goddess, with her owl's eyes and warrior's heart, prepared the stage for her hero's final act. The wheels of fate, long still, now turned with purpose. Odysseus on Ogygia began to gather timber, his hands calloused but steady, his mind alive with the promise of home. The sea, vast and treacherous, waited beyond the island's shores, its waves both a threat and a path. Poseidon's anger lingered, a storm brewing in the depths, but Athena's protection was a shield, subtle but strong. The gods in their celestial council had set the hero free, but freedom was only the beginning. Odysseus's journey, marked by monsters' magic and the relentless pull of home, would test him once more. As he felled trees and bound them with rope, his heart beat with a rhythm older than the gods themselves. The call of Ithaca, the love of Penelope, the hope of Telemachus. The divine decree had opened a door, but it was Odysseus, the man of many ways, who would walk through it, his eyes fixed on the horizon where his destiny awaited. After leaving Calypso's island on a self-made raft, Odysseus immediately faced the wrath of Poseidon, the sea god, who had not yet forgiven him. The raft, crafted with Odysseus's own hands, was a fragile thing, logs bound with sinew and rope, its sail a patchwork of hope against the vast, unyielding sea. For days he had labored under Ogygia's sun, felling trees, shaping timber, his muscles remembering the work of a man who had once built a kingdom. Calypso, her eyes heavy with reluctant farewell, had provisioned him with bread, wine, and water, her final gift a bittersweet offering to a mortal she could not keep. As he pushed off from the shore, the waves lapped gently as if mourning his departure. Odysseus, his heart alight with the promise of Ithaca, steered toward the horizon, his eyes scanning the endless blue for a glimpse of home. But the sea, ruled by Poseidon's iron will, was no friend to the man who had blinded his son. The sky darkened, clouds piling like mountains, and the wind began to howl a primal, vengeful roar that signaled the gods' undying grudge. Poseidon, from his coral throne beneath the waves, watched Odysseus with eyes like storms. The blinding of Polyphemus, the Cyclops, was a wound to his divine pride, a mortal's insolence that demanded retribution. Odysseus had dared to outwit a giant, to mock a god's kin with his cunning, calling himself nobody as he drove a burning stake into Polyphemus's eye. The Cyclops' cries had reached his father's ears, and Poseidon's wrath had followed Odysseus ever since, a shadow that churned the seas and shattered his hopes. Now, as the hero sailed alone, the god seized his chance. The waves rose, towering and frothing, each crest a fist aimed at the frail raft. The wind tore at the sail, ripping it like paper, and the sky split with lightning, illuminating Odysseus's solitary figure against the chaos. He clung to the mast, his voice shouting prayers to Athena, to Zeus, to any god who might hear him over the tempest's roar. But Poseidon's laughter echoed in the thunder, a reminder that the sea was his domain, and Odysseus was but a speck upon its wrath. The storm raged for days, or perhaps weeks, time blurred in the grip of divine fury. Odysseus, soaked and battered, fought to keep the raft afloat, his hands raw from gripping the ropes, his body aching from the sea's relentless assault. The stars, when they appeared through rents in the clouds, offered no guidance, their light swallowed by the churning dark. He thought of Ithaca, of Penelope's face, her eyes steady and warm, and of Telemachus, a son he barely knew, but loved with a father's fierce heart. These images anchored him stronger than any rope as the waves sought to drag him under. He remembered other storms, other trials, the Cyclops' cave, the Sirens' song, the hunger that had gnawed at his men on sunless islands. Each had tested him, but none had broken him. Yet this storm, born of a god's personal vengeance, felt different, as if Poseidon meant to erase him from the world, to drown the very memory of Odysseus, king of Ithaca. In the midst of the tempest, a wave like a mountain crashed over the raft, splintering it into fragments. Odysseus was plunged into the sea, his body tossed like driftwood, his lungs burning as he fought for air. The weight of the water pressed against him, a cold, suffocating embrace that whispered of surrender. But surrender was not in his nature. He kicked toward the surface, his arms clawing through the depths, his mind sharp with the will to survive. Athena, watching from her unseen perch, could not intervene directly. Poseidon's domain was beyond her reach. But she whispered courage into his heart, a subtle nudge that kept his limbs moving. He broke the surface, gasping, and clung to a piece of the shattered raft, its wood slick but solid under his hands. The sea roared around him, but he held fast, his eyes fixed on a distant glimmer, a star perhaps, or a trick of the light. It was enough to keep him fighting, to keep him alive. Days passed, or perhaps only hours. The sea warped time as surely as it warped hope. Odysseus drifted, his body battered, his strength ebbing, but his spirit unyielding. He spoke to himself, to the gods, to the ghosts of his lost companions, recounting his journey to stay awake, to stay sane. He spoke of Troy, where his wooden horse had turned defeat into victory, of Circe, whose magic had tested his humanity, of the underworld, where the dead had whispered of his destiny. These stories were his lifeline, threads of memory that tied him to the man he had been, the man he still was. The sea, though merciless, could not strip him of that. At last the storm began to wane, Poseidon's wrath spent, or perhaps restrained by Zeus's decree. The waves grew calmer, the sky clearing, to reveal a horizon tinged with gold. Odysseus, half dead, but unbroken, felt the current shift, carrying him toward an unknown shore. When land appeared a faint line of green against the blue, he wept his tears mixing with the salt water on his face. He did not know the name of this place, but it was solid, real, a reprieve from the sea's endless hunger. He crawled ashore, his body collapsing on the sand, his breath ragged but steady. The beach was soft beneath him, the air warm with the scent of olive trees and wildflowers. He was alive, though stripped of everything, his raft, his provisions, his strength. Yet Odysseus, the man of many ways, knew that survival was only the beginning. The gods had spared him, but their games were far from over. As he lay there, the sound of distant voices reached him, gentle and curious, carried on the breeze. A young woman, her hair catching the sunlight, approached Nausicaa, princess of the Phaeacians, though he did not yet know her name. Her kindness, like a beacon, drew him from the edge of despair, a reminder that even in the shadow of divine wrath, humanity could offer salvation. As he rose, weak but resolute, Odysseus felt the weight of his journey settle into his bones. Poseidon's anger had not buffeted but not broken him. The sea had tried to claim him, but he had emerged, as he always did, a survivor. The land of the Phaeacians, with its promise of aid, was a new chapter, a step closer to Ithaca. Athena's hand, he sensed, was near guiding him through the trials that remained. The thought of home, Penelope Telemachus, the rocky cliffs of his kingdom, burned bright in his heart, a flame that no god could extinguish. The sea had not defeated him, and neither would the challenges ahead. Washed ashore in the land of the Phaeacians, exhausted and with nothing, Odysseus was rescued by the kind Princess Nausicaa and brought to the palace. The beach, soft and golden under the morning sun, cradled his broken body as the waves whispered their retreat. Odysseus, the man who had outwitted giants and defied gods, lay as vulnerable as a castaway, his clothes torn to rags, his skin salted and bruised by Poseidon's wrath. The storm had stripped him of everything, his raft, his provisions, his strength, but not his will. His chest heaved with shallow breaths, each one a victory over the sea that had tried to claim him. The air was warm, scented with wild thyme, and the faint tang of olive groves a stark contrast to the cold, churning abyss he had escaped. He was alive, though, barely his body a map of scars and exhaustion, his mind still sharp with the longing for Ithaca. As he stirred, the sound of laughter, light, carefree, human, reached his ears, pulling him from the edge of oblivion. A group of young women, their voices bright as the sunlight, approached the river nearby. Their linens spread out for washing. Among them was Nausicaa, princess of the Phaeacians, her presence like a dawn breaking over his darkened world. Nausicaa, guided by Athena's subtle hand, had come to the river that morning, her heart stirred by dreams of adventure and destiny. She was young, her eyes wide with the curiosity of youth, yet there was a grace in her bearing that spoke of royalty. When she saw the stranger on the shore, naked, battered, his eyes hollow but fierce, she did not recoil. Instead, her heart, kind and unafraid, moved her to act. Odysseus, aware of his wretched state, covered himself with a branch, his voice hoarse but measured as he spoke to her. He called her a goddess, his words woven with the charm that had swayed kings and monsters alike. Yet there was truth in his plea. He was a man lost, far from home, seeking only aid to continue his journey. Nausicaa, her cheeks flushed with compassion, saw not a beggar, but a soul tested by fate. She ordered her maids to bring him clothes, oil to anoint his skin, and food to ease his hunger. Her kindness was a balm, a reminder that the world still held mercy for a wanderer like him. Clothed and revived, Odysseus followed Nausicaa's guidance to the city of the Phaeacians, his steps unsteady but resolute. The land of Scheria was a marvel, its fields lush with grain, its orchards heavy with fruit, its people blessed by the gods with peace and prosperity. The palace of King Alcinous and Queen Arete gleamed like a beacon, its bronze walls catching the light, its gardens a tapestry of color and scent. Odysseus, disguised by Athena's mist to avoid suspicion, walked through the streets, his heart stirred by the sight of a civilization untouched by the chaos he had known. The Phaeacians were a seafaring people, their ships swift and beloved by Poseidon, yet they welcomed strangers with a hospitality that felt like a gift from the heavens. As he approached the palace, the mist fell away, and Odysseus stepped into the great hall, his presence humble but commanding. The court gathered for a feast fell silent, their eyes fixed on the stranger who knelt before Arete and Alcinous, his voice steady as he begged for passage home. Arete, wise and discerning, saw something in Odysseus's eyes, a spark of nobility beneath the grime of his trials. Alcinous, generous and proud, offered him a seat at the banquet, his curiosity piqued by the stranger's bearing. The hall was alive with music and laughter, the tables laden with roasted meats, golden bread, and wine as dark as the sea. Odysseus, though weary, felt the warmth of human connection, a stark contrast to the isolation of Ogygia or the savagery of his past adventures. The Phaeacians, eager for tales, pressed him to speak of his origins, but Odysseus, cautious, held his silence at first. It was only when the blind bard Demodocus sang of the Trojan War, his voice weaving the tale of the wooden horse and Odysseus's cunning, that the hero's composure faltered. Tears welled in his eyes, unnoticed by the revelers, but caught by Alcinous's keen gaze. The king, sensing a story greater than any song, urged Odysseus to reveal his name and his journey promising aid no matter the tale. Odysseus, his heart heavy with memory, began to speak. His voice, though worn by years of hardship, carried the weight of truth, drawing the court into a spellbound silence. He revealed his name, Odysseus, king of Ithaca, the man who had sacked Troy and wandered the seas for a decade. The Phaeacians, lovers of stories, leaned forward, their eyes wide with wonder. He spoke of the Cicones, whose city he had plundered only to lose men to their vengeance. He told of the lotus eaters whose fruit tempted his crew to forget their home. He recounted the horrors of the Cyclops' cave, the seduction of Circe's island, the descent to the underworld, where he spoke with the dead. Each tale was a thread in the tapestry of his suffering, a testament to his resilience and his longing for Ithaca. The hall, once filled with laughter, now echoed with the gravity of his words. The Phaeacians, moved by the man who had faced gods and monsters, yet still yearned for a mortal life. Nausicaa, watching from her place, felt her heart stir with admiration and pity. She saw in Odysseus a hero not of strength alone, but of endurance, a man whose love for his family had carried him through unimaginable trials. Arete and Alcinous, too, were moved, their hospitality deepening into respect. They promised him a ship swift and sturdy to carry him to Ithaca, along with treasures to replace what the sea had taken. Odysseus, his heart lifted by their kindness, felt the weight of his journey lighten, if only for a moment. The Phaeacians, with their ships that sailed as if by magic, were his final bridge to home, their generosity, a counterpoint to the cruelty of the gods. As he rested that night, the palace quiet around him, he dreamed of Ithaca not as a distant hope, but as a destination now within reach. Athena, ever watchful, smiled from the shadows, her plan unfolding as the hero moved closer to his destiny. The Phaeacians, with their open hearts, had given him more than passage. They had given him hope, a spark, to carry him through the trials that awaited on his own shores. The transition from the wild, untamed sea to the ordered beauty of Scheria was a reminder of the world Odysseus fought to reclaim, a world of human connection, of kindness, of home. As he prepared to leave, his heart was a storm of gratitude and resolve. The Phaeacians, with their songs and their ships, were a brief respite, a moment of grace before the final reckoning. Ithaca called its voice clearer, now carried on the winds that would soon bear him home. Here Odysseus recounted his entire 10-year arduous journey, a series of adventures with strange creatures and deadly temptations, his voice weaving a tapestry of wonder and woe that held the Phaeacian court in rapt silence. The great hall aglow with torchlight seemed to shrink as his words filled the space, each tale a thread in the epic of his survival. King Alcinous, Queen Arete, and their nobles leaned forward, their eyes wide with awe, as Odysseus, the stranger they had welcomed, revealed himself as a hero, forged in the fires of divine caprice and mortal resilience. His voice, steady yet heavy with memory, carried the weight of a decade lost to the seas of comrades, buried beneath waves and earth, of a heart that never ceased to yearn for Ithaca. He began with the fall of Troy, where his cunning had birthed the wooden horse, a triumph that marked the start of his endless wanderings. The Phaeacians, lovers of stories, hung on his every word, their feast forgotten as they journeyed with him through a world of gods, monsters, and men. His first tale was of the Cicones, a people whose city his men had plundered in the flush of victory after Troy. Greed had clouded their judgment, and they lingered too long drinking and feasting until the Cicones rallied their spears, cutting down 6 men from each of Odysseus's ships. The loss stung, a reminder that even victory carried a price. He spoke next of the lotus eaters whose honey-sweet fruit dulled the minds of his crew, tempting them to forget their homes and their purpose. Odysseus, his will unyielding, had dragged his men back to the ships, their cries of protest echoing in his ears. These early trials, though perilous, were but a prelude to the horrors that awaited, and his voice grew quieter as he spoke of the Cyclops Polyphemus, the one-eyed giant whose cave became a tomb for 6 of his men. Trapped in the monster's lair, Odysseus had used his wit, offering wine to dull Polyphemus's senses, then driving a sharpened stake into his eye, while declaring his name as nobody. The escape, daring and triumphant, had earned him Poseidon's wrath, a curse that would haunt him across the seas. The Phaeacians gasped as he recounted his encounter with the wind god Aeolus, who gifted him a bag of winds to speed his journey home. But his crew, driven by suspicion and greed, opened the bag, unleashing a storm that blew them back to Aeolus's island, only to be cast out as cursed men. The memory of their despair, the sea stretching endlessly before them, tightened Odysseus's voice. He spoke of the Laestrygonians, cannibal giants, who smashed his fleet, leaving only one ship to limp away. Each loss carved deeper into his soul the names of the dead, a litany he carried in silence. Yet it was the tale of Circe, the enchantress, that stirred the court's imagination. Her island, lush and deceptive, had turned his men into swine with a wave of her wand. Odysseus, protected by Hermes' gift of moly, resisted her magic and won her favor, spending a year in her arms, a respite laced with guilt for Ithaca still called. Circe's counsel sent him to the underworld, a journey that chilled the hall's warmth, as he described the land of shades. In the underworld, Odysseus spoke with the dead heroes, prophets, and his own mother, whose passing he had not known. Her ghost, frail and sorrowful, told him of Ithaca's plight, of Penelope's struggle, of Telemachus's growth. The prophet Tiresias warned of trials yet to come, of Poseidon's anger and the suitor's greed. These prophecies, etched into his heart, gave him purpose, even as the shades of his fallen comrades, Trojans and Greeks alike, crowded around their voices, a chorus of loss. The Phaeacians, their eyes glistening, felt the weight of his grief, the burden of a leader who carried his men's deaths as his own. Odysseus's voice softened as he spoke of the Sirens, whose song promised knowledge but delivered death. He had lashed himself to the mast, his ears plugged with wax, to hear their call without succumbing, his heart torn between curiosity and duty. The court marveled at his restraint, a man who craved wisdom, yet chose survival. The tale of Scylla and Charybdis drew murmurs of horror. Navigating the strait between the whirlpool's maw and the six-headed monster Odysseus faced an impossible choice: lose all to Charybdis's hunger or sacrifice a few to Scylla's jaws. He chose the lesser death, watching in anguish as 6 men were torn from the deck, their screams haunting his dreams. The Phaeacians, safe in their peaceful land, could scarcely imagine such a choice. Their faces pale as Odysseus described the balance of leadership, the cost of saving the many at the expense of the few. He spoke of the island of the sun god, where his starving crew, against his warnings, slaughtered sacred cattle. Zeus's lightning struck their ship in retribution, leaving Odysseus alone, clinging to wreckage until he washed ashore on Calypso's island. There he lingered for 7 years, a prisoner of love, his heart fixed on Ithaca, despite the nymph's divine allure. As he finished, the hall was silent, the weight of his journey settling over the court like a shroud. Alcinous, his eyes moist, raised a cup, declaring Odysseus a guest worthy of their aid. Arete, her wisdom mirroring Penelope's, saw in him a man whose suffering had refined his soul. Nausicaa, her heart stirred by his courage, felt a quiet pride in her role as his rescuer. The Phaeacians, moved by his tales, saw not just a hero, but a man, a father, a husband, a king, whose love for home had carried him through a decade of torment. Odysseus, his voice hoarse from speaking, felt the weight of his past lift, if only slightly. Sharing his story had been a catharsis, a way to honor the men he had lost, the trials he had endured. The Phaeacians, with their ships and their kindness, were his bridge to Ithaca, a final gift before the reckoning that awaited. As the feast resumed, the hall filled with music once more, but Odysseus's thoughts were already turning to the sea, to the journey ahead. His tales, though told to strangers, were a map of his soul, a testament to the resilience that had brought him here. Athena, unseen but ever present, watched with pride, knowing her hero was nearing the end of his wanderings. The Phaeacians, their hearts open, prepared a ship to carry him home, their generosity a counterpoint to the gods' cruelty. Odysseus, sitting among them, felt the pull of Ithaca stronger than ever, its cliffs and olive groves no longer a dream but a destination. The trials of the past had shaped him, but it was the promise of home, Penelope's embrace, Telemachus's voice that would carry him forward. He told of his encounter with the one-eyed giant Polyphemus, where he used his cunning to escape by calling himself a body. His voice in the Phaeacian hall, carrying the weight of a memory, both triumphant and cursed. The great hall, its bronze walls flickering with torchlight, grew still as Odysseus's words painted a world of raw danger and desperate ingenuity. The Phaeacians, their feast forgotten, leaned closer, their eyes wide with the thrill of a tale that seemed to bridge the mortal and the monstrous. Odysseus, his gaze distant, relived the moment his ship had landed on the Cyclops' rugged island, its cliffs jagged against a sky untroubled by gods. He and his men, weary from battles with the Cicones and the seductive haze of the Lotus Eaters, had sought only provisions, food, water, a moment's rest. The cave they found was a trove of plenty cheeses stacked high, lambs bleating in pens, milk pails brimming under the watchful eye of a giant, whose single orb gleamed like a baleful moon. Polyphemus, son of Poseidon, was no mere beast, but a force of nature, his strength as unyielding as the stone that sealed his cave, trapping Odysseus and 12 of his men within. The air in the cave had been thick with the scent of wool and curdling milk, but fear soon soured it. Polyphemus, returning with his flock, towered over the intruders, his voice a rumble that shook the earth. He asked no questions before seizing 2 of Odysseus's men, dashing their skulls against the cave floor, their blood pooling as he devoured them like a lion. The Phaeacians gasped, their hands gripping goblets, as Odysseus described the horror, the crunch of bone, the giant's careless hunger, the helplessness of watching comrades die. His men huddled in the shadows, looked to him, their captain, their king whose mind had outwitted Troy's walls. Odysseus, his heart pounding, but his thoughts racing, knew brute force was useless against such a creature. The giant's strength was a mountain, but his mind was a chink in the stone, a weakness Odysseus could exploit. He offered Polyphemus wine, a gift from their stores, its sweetness masking its potency. The giant, unused to such delights, drank deeply, his laughter slurring as he demanded the stranger's name. "Nobody." Odysseus replied, his voice steady, a spark of guile in his eyes. The Phaeacians, hanging on his words, sensed the turning of the tale, the moment where wit would triumph over might. As Polyphemus slept drunken and sated, Odysseus and his men moved with the silence of hunters. They found a massive olive stake. Its tip hardened in the fire and drove it into the Cyclops' single eye, twisting it like a shipwright's drill. The giant's roar was a thunderclap, shaking the cave, his hands clawing at the burning wound as he screamed for nobody to be cursed. Odysseus paused in his telling, his voice catching, and the Phaeacians felt the chill of that moment, the desperate gamble, the thin line between survival and doom. The other Cyclopes, drawn by Polyphemus's cries, gathered outside, asking who had harmed him. "Nobody," he bellowed, and they left, dismissing his pain as madness. Odysseus's cunning had bought them time, but escape was still a puzzle. Polyphemus, blind but raging, guarded the cave's entrance, his hands sweeping for the intruders. Odysseus, his mind a whirl of plans, devised a new scheme. He and his men lashed themselves beneath the giant's rams, clinging to their woolly underbellies, as Polyphemus, unsuspecting, let his flock out to graze. The Phaeacians marveled, their murmurs filling the hall, as Odysseus described the tension of that escape. Their breaths held the ram's hooves clattering, the giant's hands grazing so close they could feel his heat. They reached their ship, the sea a promise of freedom, but Odysseus's pride, his fatal flaw, could not stay silent. As they sailed away, he shouted his true name, Odysseus, son of Laertes, king of Ithaca. The Phaeacians stirred, sensing the cost of that boast. Polyphemus, his voice a wounded roar, called upon Poseidon, his father, to curse the man who had blinded him. Let him wander the seas, he prayed. Let him lose all his men, let him return home late and broken. Odysseus's voice grew heavy as he recounted the moment, the weight of the curse settling like a storm cloud. The Phaeacians, their eyes on their guest, saw not just a hero, but a man who had paid dearly for his triumph. That curse had followed him, its shadow cast across every wave, every trial, from the winds of Aeolus to the jaws of Scylla. Poseidon's wrath, born in that cave, had shaped his decade of wandering, a reminder that even the cleverest mortal could not outrun a god's vengeance. Yet the tale was not all loss. Odysseus spoke of the fire it had kindled in him, the resolve to survive, to outwit the fates. The Cyclops' cave had been a crucible forging his cunning into a weapon sharper than any sword. He had lost 6 men, their names etched in his heart, but he had saved the rest, leading them through fear and despair. The Phaeacians, their faces lit with admiration, saw in him a leader who bore the weight of his choices, a man whose victories were as costly as his defeats. Alcinous, his voice warm with respect, praised Odysseus's wit, declaring him a guest worthy of their finest ship. Arete, her eyes sharp, saw the pain beneath his triumph, the scars of a man who had faced the divine and lived. Nausicaa, her heart stirred, felt a quiet pride in aiding such a soul. The hall, alive with the echo of his story, seemed to pulse with the rhythm of his journey, a rhythm of loss, cunning, and unyielding hope. As Odysseus finished, his gaze drifted to the sea beyond the palace, its waves glinting under the moon. The Cyclops had been his greatest test of wit, but also the spark of his greatest trial. Poseidon's curse had stretched his journey into a decade of torment, yet it had not broken him. The Phaeacians, with their kindness and their ships, were a bridge to the next chapter, a chance to face the curse's final weight. Ithaca waited its call stronger than ever, and Odysseus, the man of many ways, felt the fire of his purpose rekindle. The cave of Polyphemus had been a turning point, a moment where he had claimed victory over a monster, only to awaken a god's wrath. That wrath still lingered, but so did his resolve, a flame that burned brighter than any giant's eye. He told of the sorceress Circe, who turned his crew into swine, and of his journey to the underworld, to speak with the dead. His voice in the Phaeacian hall, weaving a tale that danced between enchantment and dread, drawing the court into a world where magic and mortality collided. The torches flickered, casting shadows that seemed to sway with his words, as Odysseus recounted the moment, his lone ship, battered by the Laestrygonian savagery, limped to the shores of Aia, Circe's island. The air there was heavy with the scent of cedar and myrtle, the island lush with beauty that masked its danger. His men, weary and hungry, their numbers dwindling from one trial to the next, had followed a path to Circe's gleaming hall, lured by the promise of food and rest. The Phaeacians, their eyes wide, listened as Odysseus described the enchantress, her hair like spun gold, her voice a melody that wove spells into the air. She welcomed his men with honeyed wine and golden plates, but her feast was a trap. With a wave of her wand, she transformed them into swine, their human cries twisting into grunts as they rooted in the dirt, their minds clouded, but their hearts still aware of their loss. Odysseus, spared by fate or divine whim, learned of their plight from Eurylochus, a scout who had resisted Circe's charm. His heart burned with rage and fear, but his mind, ever sharp, turned to strategy. Alone he set out for her hall, his sword useless against her magic. The Phaeacians leaned closer, their breath held as he spoke of Hermes, the swift-footed god, who appeared on the path with a gift, a sprig of moly, a sacred herb with roots black as night and flowers white as milk. "This will shield you," Hermes whispered, his eyes glinting with divine mischief. "But your wit must do the rest." Armed with the moly, Odysseus entered Circe's hall, where she offered him the same cursed wine. He drank unharmed, and when she raised her wand, he lunged his sword at her throat, his voice commanding her to free his men. The Phaeacians marveled at his audacity, a mortal challenging a goddess, but Circe, struck by his courage and protected by Hermes' intervention, yielded. With a touch, she restored his men. Their human forms returned, though their eyes carried the weight of their ordeal. Circe's island, Odysseus continued, became a strange haven. For a year he and his men lingered, feasting in her halls, their bodies healed by her hospitality, their spirits soothed by her songs. Yet the Phaeacians sensed a shadow in his voice, a guilt that lingered beneath the tale. Circe's beauty, her bed, her promises of comfort, had tempted Odysseus, drawing him into her arms, but his heart remained anchored to Ithaca, to Penelope, whose face haunted his dreams even in the warmth of another's embrace. The year was a respite, a pause in the relentless march of his trials, but it was also a test of his resolve. His men, restless, urged him to sail on, and Circe, her love for him, both genuine and fleeting, did not bind him. Instead, she offered a path forward, a prophecy that chilled his soul. To reach Ithaca, he must journey to the underworld, to the house of Hades, where the dead would speak of his fate. The Phaeacians, their faces pale, felt the weight of such a quest, a living man descending to the realm of shades, a place where even heroes faltered. The journey to the underworld was a descent into darkness, a voyage that tested Odysseus's courage beyond any monster or storm. He sailed to the edge of the world, where the sun never rose, where the rivers of the dead flowed cold and silent. The Phaeacians, their hall now hushed, listened as he described the ritual Circe had taught him, digging a trench, pouring libations of milk, honey wine, and blood to summon the shades. The air grew thick with their presence, a chorus of whispers rising from the earth. First came the prophet Tiresias, his blind eyes seeing more than the living ever could. He spoke of Odysseus's trials, the wrath of Poseidon, the suitors plaguing Ithaca, the narrow path to home. "You will return," Tiresias said, his voice a dry rasp, but late alone and broken on a stranger's ship. The words were a blade cutting through Odysseus's hope, yet they gave him purpose, a map to navigate the trials ahead. The Phaeacians, their eyes glistening, felt the weight of prophecy, the burden of knowing one's fate, yet facing it unflinching. Then came the shades of the dead heroes of Troy, their armor gone, their voices hollow. Agamemnon, betrayed by his wife, warned of trust misplaced. Achilles, his glory faded, mourned the life he had lost. But it was the sight of his mother Anticlea that broke Odysseus's heart. She had died of grief, waiting for her son, her ghost frail and sorrowful. As she spoke of Ithaca's plight, Penelope's struggle, Telemachus's growth, the suitor's greed. Odysseus reached for her, his arms aching to hold her, but she slipped through his grasp, a shadow dissolving into mist. The Phaeacians, some wiping tears, understood the pain of that moment. A son's love thwarted by death, a reminder of the years stolen from him. The dead offered wisdom, warnings, and grief, but they also steeled his resolve. He left the underworld with a heavier heart, but a clearer purpose, his eyes fixed on the living world, on the home he would reclaim. Circe, upon his return, offered final counsel, warnings of the Sirens, Scylla and Charybdis trials that awaited on the sea. Her island, once a prison of enchantment, had become a crucible preparing him for the journey ahead. The Phaeacians, their hearts stirred by his tales, saw Odysseus not as a wanderer, but as a man shaped by the divine and the dead, his spirit tempered by love and loss. Alcinous, raising a cup, declared him a guest worthy of their aid, while Arete's eyes held a quiet respect for his endurance. Nausicaa, her heart full, felt the weight of his longing, a mirror to her own dreams of a world beyond Scheria. Odysseus, his voice weary but resolute, finished his tale, his thoughts already turning to the sea, to Ithaca, to the trials that awaited. The underworld had shown him the cost of his journey, but also its purpose, Penelope, Telemachus' home. The Phaeacians with their swift ships were his final bridge, a chance to end his wandering and face the destiny Tiresias had foretold. And he told of navigating the strait between the two monsters, Scylla and Charybdis. A painful choice between two horrifying deaths, his voice in the Phaeacian hall heavy with the weight of a leader's burden, each word etching the cost of survival into the hearts of his listeners. The torches burned low, their flickering light casting shadows that seemed to writhe like the monsters he described as Odysseus recounted one of the darkest trials of his decade-long Odyssey. The Phaeacians, their eyes wide with dread and awe, leaned closer, their feast forgotten, as he painted a scene of a narrow strait where the sea itself turned predator. On one side loomed Charybdis, a whirlpool with a maw that could swallow a ship whole, its currents a vortex of death that pulled men into the abyss. On the other Scylla, a six-headed beast perched in a cave high above her necks, long and serpentine, each mouth lined with teeth that gleamed like obsidian. Circe the enchantress had warned him of this passage, her voice grave, as she told him no ship could pass unscathed. The choice was his risk all to Charybdis's hunger, or sacrifice a few to Scylla's jaws. The Phaeacians, safe in their peaceful land, could scarcely fathom such a decision. Their faces pale as Odysseus's voice carried them into the heart of his despair. He described the approach, his ship gliding through a sea deceptively calm, the air thick with the salt of impending doom. His men, their faces gaunt from hunger and fear, gripped their oars, their eyes darting between the churning waters and the cliffs above. Odysseus, standing at the helm, felt the weight of their trust, a burden heavier than the waves. Circe's counsel echoed in his mind. Charybdis could destroy them all, but Scylla would take only six men, 6 lives, 6 names he would carry forever. He chose the lesser evil, though the word lesser felt like a betrayal. He did not tell his men of Scylla, fearing their panic would doom them all. Instead, he urged them to row hard, to hug the cliffs, his voice steady even as his heart raced. The Phaeacians, their breath held, felt the tension of that moment, the silent prayer that speed might outrun fate. The strait narrowed the cliffs, closing in like the jaws of a trap, and then Scylla struck her heads, darting down with the speed of lightning, her mouths seizing 6 men from the deck. Their screams, sharp and fleeting, pierced Odysseus's soul, their arms reaching for him as they were lifted into the air, their bodies torn apart before his eyes. The hall was silent. The Phaeacians frozen as Odysseus paused, his voice breaking under the memory. He spoke their names, 6 comrades, brothers in arms, who had survived Troy the Cyclops, the Laestrygonians, only to meet their end in Scylla's jaws. He described their faces, their courage, the way they had trusted him to lead them home. The choice had saved the ship, but it had cost him a piece of his humanity. The Phaeacians, their eyes glistening, understood the torment of leadership, the necessity of sacrifice, the guilt that lingered like a shadow. Odysseus recounted how the ship sailed on Charybdis's whirlpool, roaring to starboard its pull, a reminder of the death they had narrowly escaped. His men, stunned and grieving, rowed in silence, their trust in him shaken but unbroken. He had spared them the full truth of Scylla, but the weight of his decision was his alone to bear. The sea, vast and uncaring, stretched before them, its horizon a promise of more trials, more losses. He spoke of what followed, the island of the sun god, where his men, driven by starvation, defied his warnings and slaughtered sacred cattle. The Phaeacians murmured, sensing the hubris of that act, the defiance that invited divine wrath. Zeus's lightning struck their ship, splintering it into wreckage, drowning all but Odysseus, who clung to a spar adrift for days until he washed ashore on Calypso's island. The tale of Scylla and Charybdis, though, lingered in the hall, its horror sharper than the storm that followed. It was a story of choices, of the impossible balance between survival and sacrifice of a leader who carried the weight of every life lost. Odysseus's voice, steady but laced with sorrow, conveyed the toll of that moment, the screams that haunted his dreams, the faces he saw in every wave, the Phaeacians. Their hearts heavy saw not just a hero, but a man scarred by the burdens of command, a king who had faced the monstrous and lived, but at a cost no victory could erase. Alcinous, his voice thick with emotion, raised a cup declaring Odysseus a man of unmatched endurance. Arete, her eyes sharp with understanding, saw the pain beneath his strength, the humanity that made him more than a myth. Nausicaa, her heart stirred, felt a quiet admiration for the man who had faced such horrors, yet still spoke of home with unwavering love. The hall, alive with the echo of his tale, seemed to pulse with the rhythm of his journey, a rhythm of loss, choice, and unyielding resolve. Odysseus, his gaze drifting to the sea, beyond the palace, felt the weight of Scylla's jaws, as if they still reached for him. That choice, that sacrifice, had been a turning point, a moment where he had traded lives for survival, a wound that would never fully heal. Yet it had brought him here to the Phaeacians, whose kindness was a balm, whose ships were a promise of Ithaca. As the feast resumed, the music softer now, Odysseus's thoughts turned to the trials ahead. The strait of Scylla and Charybdis had been a crucible testing his leadership, his heart, his humanity. The Phaeacians, with their generosity, offered a chance to move forward, to face the final challenges that awaited on his own shores. Ithaca called its voice a beacon through the darkness of his memories. The screams of his men, the roar of the whirlpool, the snap of Scylla's jaws. They were part of him now, but so was the hope of home, of Penelope's embrace, of Telemachus's voice. Athena, unseen but ever present, watched with pride, knowing her hero was nearing the end of his wanderings. His spirit forged anew by the choices that had both broken and defined him. Moved by Odysseus's story, the Phaeacians gave him a ship to take him back to Ithaca, and the hero finally set foot on his homeland. After 20 years away, his heart, a storm of hope and trepidation, as the familiar cliffs rose from the sea like a dream made solid. The great hall of King Alcinous had fallen silent, as Odysseus's tales of Cyclops enchantresses and the harrowing strait of Scylla and Charybdis wove a spell over the court. Their hearts stirred by the man who had faced gods and monsters, yet spoke of home with a longing that transcended his trials. Alcinous, his eyes bright with admiration, declared Odysseus a guest worthy of their finest aid, his voice echoing with the generosity of a king whose people revered the sea. Queen golfers, their faces lit with compassion, pledged a ship swift and sturdy to carry him to Ithaca, along with treasures of gold, bronze, and finely woven cloth to honor his journey. Arete, her wisdom, seeing the soul beneath the wanderer's scars, added her blessing, her voice soft but firm, as she wished him strength for the trials ahead. Nausicaa, her heart full, watched him with a quiet pride, her role as his rescuer, a thread in the tapestry of his return. As the Phaeacians prepared their ship, its sails gleaming under the dawn, Odysseus stood on the shore, his eyes fixed on the horizon, the weight of 2 decades of exile lifting with each breath of the salt-laden air. The ship sailed with a grace that seemed almost divine, its oars cutting through the waves, as if guided by Poseidon himself, though Odysseus knew the sea god's wrath still lingered. The Phaeacians, skilled mariners blessed by the gods, navigated with a precision that made the sea seem a willing partner, its currents bending to their will. Odysseus, standing at the prow, felt the wind on his face, its touch both familiar and strange after years of captivity and storm. The crew, silent but respectful, gave him space, sensing the weight of his thoughts. He spoke little, his mind a whirl of memories, Penelope's laughter, Telemachus's infant cries, the rocky cliffs of Ithaca where he had once stood as king. 20 years had passed since he left for Troy, a young warrior full of fire and ambition. Now he was a man carved by loss, his hair streaked with gray, his heart scarred by the faces of the dead. Yet the promise of home burned bright, a flame that had carried him through the darkest trials. The sea, vast and unyielding, seemed to soften as they neared Ithaca, its waves gentler, as if the gods had finally relented. As the ship drew closer, the outlines of Ithaca emerged, rugged, unyielding, yet beautiful in its stark simplicity. The cliffs rose sharp against the sky, their edges softened by olive groves and wild thyme, the air heavy with the scent of home. Odysseus's breath caught his eyes, stinging with tears he would not shed. The Phaeacians, their task nearly done, lowered the sails, their voices quiet as they sensed the gravity of the moment. The ship glided to a hidden cove, its hull kissing the shore with a sigh. Odysseus stepped onto the sand, his knees trembling as he felt the earth of Ithaca beneath his feet. 20 years, half a lifetime, had passed since he last stood here, a king setting out for war, his heart full of glory. Now he was a stranger in his own land, his kingdom overrun by suitors, his wife and son fighting to hold it together. He knelt, pressing his hands to the earth, its warmth a promise of redemption. The Phaeacians, their duty fulfilled, unloaded their gifts, chests of gold, bronze vessels, bolts of cloth finer than any Ithaca could weave. They spoke no words of farewell, only bowed deeply, their eyes full of respect for the man whose story had moved them to tears. Odysseus watched the ship depart, its sails catching the wind as it vanished into the mist. He was alone now, a king without a crown, a hero without an army. The treasures at his side were a fortune, but they meant nothing compared to the task ahead. Ithaca was not the home he had left. It was a battlefield, its heart besieged by arrogant suitors who feasted on his wealth and pressed Penelope to betray him. His heart ached at the thought of her, her clever mind and steadfast love holding the kingdom together against impossible odds. Telemachus, a boy when he left, was now a man, his strength untested, but his blood that of a king. Odysseus's hand tightened around the staff the Phaeacians had given him, its wood smooth and strong, a symbol of the journey behind and the trials ahead. He was no longer the brash warrior who had sailed to Troy. He was a man of cunning tempered by suffering, ready to reclaim what was his. Athena, ever his protector, was near. He felt it in the air, a subtle shift in the wind, a whisper of divine presence. She had guided him through the fires of Troy, the storms of Poseidon, the temptations of Calypso and Circe. Now, as he stood on Ithaca's shores, he sensed her hand in what was to come. The suitors he knew would not yield easily. Their greed had festered too long, their arrogance blinding them to the danger of a king's return. Odysseus's mind, sharp as ever, began to weave a plan not of brute force but of stealth, of guile, of the cunning that had outwitted giants and gods. He would not march into his palace as a conqueror. He would slip in as a shadow, a beggar in rags, to learn the truth of his home. The thought of seeing Penelope, of looking into her eyes after 20 years, sent a shiver through him. Would she know him, this weathered man with scars where youth once stood? Would Telemachus, a stranger to his father, see the king beneath the wanderer's guise? The sun climbed higher, its light bathing the cove in gold, and Odysseus felt the weight of his destiny settle upon him. The Phaeacians had given him passage, but the journey was not over. Ithaca was his, but it was a kingdom in chaos, its heart held together by the courage of a queen and a prince. He gathered the treasures, hiding them in a cave known only to him, a place where he had once played as a boy. The act felt like a ritual, a reclaiming of his past, a promise to restore his future. The path to the palace lay ahead through hills and groves he knew by heart, though time had changed their contours. He moved slowly, his body aching from years of hardship, but his spirit alight with purpose. The Phaeacians' ship was gone, but their kindness lingered, a bridge between his wandering and his return. Ithaca stood before him, its cliffs a challenge, its heart a prize. The gods, the suitors, the years, they had all tried to break him, but Odysseus, the man of many ways, was home at last. With Athena's help, Odysseus disguised himself as an old beggar to secretly investigate the situation and test the loyalty of those who remained, his heart pounding with a mix of cunning and caution as he stepped into the shadow of his own kingdom. The rugged cliffs of Ithaca, bathed in the golden light of dawn, stood as both a welcome and a warning, their familiar contours now hiding a world altered by 20 years of absence. Athena, the gray-eyed goddess, who had guided him through wars and storms, appeared beside him in the cove, where the Phaeacians had left him. Her form cloaked in mist, her voice sharp with purpose. She wove a spell around him, transforming the weathered hero into a figure of pity. A bent old man, his hair thinned to wisps, his skin wrinkled and grimed, his fine clothes replaced with tattered rags. The staff in his hand became a crutch, his stride a shuffle, his kingly bearing hidden beneath a stoop of feigned frailty. To the world he was no longer Odysseus, king of Ithaca, but a nameless wanderer, a beggar seeking alms. Yet beneath the disguise his eyes burned with the fire of a man who had outwitted gods, his mind already weaving a plan to reclaim his home. The path to the palace wound through olive groves and rocky hills, each step a reunion with the land he had dreamed of for 2 decades. The air carried the scent of wild thyme and salt, a reminder of the boy who had once roamed these paths, a prince who had become a king. Now he was a stranger, his disguise a shield against the chaos that awaited. Athena, walking unseen beside him, whispered of the suitors, over 100 men, arrogant and greedy, who had overrun his palace, feasting on his wealth, and pressing Penelope to choose a new husband. She spoke of Telemachus, his son grown into a man, yet untested in battle, and of Penelope, whose cunning rivaled his own, holding the suitors at bay with her wit. Odysseus's heart ached at their names, the weight of their struggle a spur to his resolve. He would not storm the palace with a sword. He would slip in like a shadow, learning the loyalties of those who remained, testing the hearts of servants, allies, and kin. The goddess's magic hid his face, but his mind was his own, sharp as ever, ready to unravel the web of betrayal and fidelity that awaited. As he approached a humble swineherd's hut, the first test of loyalty emerged. Eumaeus the swineherd had tended Odysseus's pigs since boyhood, his loyalty a quiet legend among the faithful. Odysseus, his beggar's guise perfect, hobbled toward the hut, his staff tapping the earth, his eyes scanning for signs of recognition. Eumaeus, weathered by years, but kind, welcomed the stranger with a warmth that stirred Odysseus's heart. Over a simple meal of bread and roasted pork, the swineherd spoke of his lost master, his voice thick with grief, believing Odysseus dead, yet honoring his memory with every act. He cursed the suitors, their greed a blight on Ithaca, and praised Telemachus, who had grown strong, but stood alone against their numbers. Odysseus, his heart swelling, tested Eumaeus further, spinning tales of a wanderer who had heard of Odysseus's survival. The swineherd's hope flared, then dimmed his loyalty, unshaken, but tempered by years of despair. Odysseus, moved by his steadfastness, held his secret, knowing the time for truth was not yet come. The journey to the palace brought another reunion, one that tore at his soul. As he neared the gates, a dog, old mangy, lying in a pile of refuse, lifted its head, its ears twitching at the stranger's approach. Argos the hound, Odysseus had trained as a pup, recognized his master despite the years and the disguise. His tail wagged weakly, his eyes clouded but bright with memory, and Odysseus, his throat tight, turned away to hide his tears. Argos, loyal to the end, lay down and died, his purpose fulfilled in seeing his master return. The Phaeacians' tales had not prepared Odysseus for this, a moment of love and loss that struck deeper than any monster's claw. He pressed on his beggar's guise, a mask for the grief and rage that burned within. The palace loomed ahead, its walls, once a symbol of his strength, now echoing with the suitors' revelry, their laughter a mockery of his legacy. Inside the great hall was a scene of chaos. The suitors sprawled across tables gorged on his livestock, their voices loud with wine and arrogance. Odysseus, as the beggar shuffled in his head, bowed his eyes sharp beneath the guise. The suitors mocked him, tossing scraps like insults, their cruelty, a mirror of their greed. Yet among the servants, he found glimmers of loyalty, Eurycleia, the nursemaid who had raised him. Her eyes lingering on the beggar, with a flicker of suspicion, though she did not pierce Athena's spell. Penelope Regal, even in her weariness, moved among them, her presence a quiet defiance. Odysseus watched her from the shadows, his heart aching at the lines time had etched on her face, the strength in her gaze undimmed by years of struggle. She offered the beggar kindness, a seat by the fire, her voice gentle, as she asked of news from afar. He spun a tale of a traveler who had seen Odysseus alive but delayed, and her eyes, those eyes he had dreamed of, glistened with hope she dared not voice. Telemachus, too, was there, a young man with his father's fire, though tempered by caution. Odysseus, his heart pounding, tested his son, subtly speaking of Ithaca's lost king, gauging his loyalty. Telemachus's words were fierce, his love for his father, a blade against the suitor's insolence. Athena, guiding the moment, arranged a meeting beyond the hall's chaos. In a quiet grove, she lifted the disguise, revealing Odysseus to his son. The reunion was a storm of tears and embraces, father and son clinging to each other, the years of separation melting in the warmth of their bond. Telemachus, his voice breaking, spoke of the suitors' numbers, their weapons, their power. Odysseus, his mind already turning, laid out a plan not of force, but of cunning, a trap to reclaim their home. The Phaeacians' ship had brought him to Ithaca, but it was Athena's guile and his own that would win the day. The palace, its air thick with the suitors' greed, stood on the edge of reckoning. Odysseus, the beggar, moved among them, his eyes noting every face, every betrayal, every spark of loyalty. The gods had brought him home, but the battle was his to fight. Penelope, Telemachus, Eumaeus, Eurycleia, they were his allies, their hearts tied to his own. The suitors, blind to the storm, gathering in rags, continued their revelry, unaware that the king they mocked was among them, his will unbroken, his purpose clear. Meanwhile, Penelope, to delay the suitors, proposed a final challenge. Whoever could string Odysseus's great bow and shoot an arrow through 12 axe heads could marry her, her voice steady but heavy with the weight of a plan born of desperation and cunning, a last stand to protect the kingdom she had guarded for 20 years. The great hall of Ithaca's palace, once a place of warmth and feasting, now reeked of wine and arrogance, its air thick with the suitors' raucous demands. For years, Penelope had held them at bay, her mind a fortress, as unyielding as the cliffs of her island. Her weaving trick, spinning a shroud for Laertes by day, unraveling it by night, had bought her time, but the suitors' patience had worn thin, their greed sharpened by the belief that Odysseus was dead. They pressed her daily, their voices a cacophony of flattery and threats, each man eager to claim her hand and the throne of Ithaca. Penelope, her beauty softened by grief, but her resolve as sharp as a blade, knew she could delay no longer. The challenge of the bow, a relic of her husband's strength, was her final gambit, a test no suitor could pass, a beacon to call Odysseus home, even if she dared not hope he still lived. The hall buzzed with anticipation as Penelope descended from her chambers, her presence silencing the suitors' revelry. She carried herself with the grace of a queen, her eyes weary but fierce, her hands steady as they held the great bow. Odysseus's bow, a weapon crafted for a king's strength, its wood dark and polished, its string taut with the promise of power. The suitors sprawled across benches, their faces flushed with wine, eyed the bow with a mix of curiosity and contempt. Antinous, their leader, his voice dripping with arrogance, mocked the challenge, believing it a simple task for men of their stature. Eurymachus, smoother, but no less vile, offered honeyed words, his eyes lingering on Penelope with a hunger that made her skin crawl. She stood before them, her voice clear as she laid out the terms. String the bow shoot. An arrow through the narrow rings of 12 axe heads aligned in a row, a feat requiring not just strength, but precision, a skill only Odysseus had ever mastered. The suitors, blind to the trap, accepted their laughter echoing as they saw only a prize, not a test of their unworthiness. The axes were set, their iron heads gleaming in the torchlight, their handles buried in the earth, their rings aligned in a path so narrow it seemed impossible. The bow placed on a table seemed to pulse with a life of its own, a relic of a king who had once ruled this hall. Penelope's heart ached as she touched it, her fingers tracing the wood where Odysseus's hands had rested, her mind flooded with memories of their life before the war, their laughter, their shared dreams, the unmovable bed he had carved from a living olive tree. She had woven this challenge from those memories, a test that honored her husband's strength and defied the suitor's greed. She stood aside, her eyes scanning the hall, lingering on the beggar in the shadows, the old man who had spoken of Odysseus with such certainty, his presence a spark of hope she barely dared to nurture. Telemachus, standing near his jaw set with his father's fire, watched the suitors with a quiet fury, knowing the challenge was a stage for a reckoning he and the beggar had planned in secret. One by one the suitors tried and failed. Antinous, his muscles straining, could not even bend the bow, his curses sharp as he tossed it aside. Eurymachus, his charm faltering, managed to string it part way, but his hands trembled, and the bow resisted as if it knew its true master. Others followed their boasts, turning to frustration, their laughter fading into silence. The hall, once loud with their arrogance, grew tense, the air heavy with their failure. Penelope watched her face, a mask of calm, though her heart raced. The bow was more than a weapon. It was a symbol of Odysseus's presence, a challenge that mocked the suitor's claims to his throne. She glanced at the beggar, his eyes sharp beneath his rags, and a flicker of suspicion stirred. Could this stranger, this wanderer, know more than he said? She pushed the thought aside, her hope too fragile to bear such weight. Telemachus, his voice firm, urged the suitors to continue, his words laced with a challenge that hinted at the storm to come. The beggar, unnoticed by most, stepped forward, his movements slow but deliberate. The suitors jeered, their laughter cruel, mocking the old man who dared to touch a king's weapon. Yet Penelope, her intuition stirred. In the air, a ripple of something greater than the suitor's failure. She allowed the beggar to try, her voice soft, but commanding her decision, a quiet act of defiance against the men who had overrun her home. The hall fell silent as the beggar took the bow, his hands steady despite his frail appearance. The suitor's mockery grew louder, but Telemachus, standing near, watched with a knowing glint in his eye, his heart pounding with the secret he shared with the stranger. The moment was a pivot, a turning point, where the past and the future would meet, where a king's return would begin to unravel the chaos that had consumed his home. The challenge, Penelope's final stand, was more than a delay. It was a call to Odysseus, a test that only he could pass. The bow, heavy with memory, waited for its master, its string taut with the promise of justice. The suitors, blind to the trap, saw only a prize, but Penelope's heart held a deeper truth. She was weaving a path for her husband's return, a way to restore the kingdom they had built together. The beggar's hands on the bow were a spark, a sign that the gods perhaps had not forsaken them. The hall, its air thick with tension, stood on the edge of revelation, the echoes of 20 years of longing about to break free. Requirements. Review. Expand the bullet point into a fully developed paragraph starting from the opening sentence. After all the suitors had failed, the old beggar gently strung the bow, and in the stunned silence of the hall, the arrow flew a perfect path. Write only the content without adding comments or explanations. Each paragraph must be 800 to 1,000 words in length. Use sentences with natural line breaks and pauses crafted for AI voice narration to sound like natural human speech with a rhythm that reflects real breathing patterns. Ensure smooth, seamless transitions between paragraphs to maintain a natural flow. After all the suitors had failed, the old beggar gently strung the bow, and in the stunned silence of the hall, the arrow flew a perfect path, its flight a whisper of destiny that shattered the suitors' arrogance and heralded the return of a king. The great hall of Ithaca's palace, its air thick with the stench of wine and the suitors' fading bravado, had grown tense as each man tried and failed to master Odysseus's great bow. Antinous, his face red with effort, had cursed as the bow resisted his strength, its string unyielding, as if mocking his ambition. Eurymachus, his charm fraying, had faltered, his hands trembling under the weight of failure. One by one, the suitors, over 100 men who had plundered Ithaca's wealth and pressed Penelope for her hand, had stumbled, their boasts silenced by the bow's defiance. The axes, their iron rings aligned in a narrow gauntlet, stood like sentinels, a challenge that demanded not just strength, but the precision of a king who had once ruled this hall. Penelope, her eyes sharp with a hope she dared not name, watched from the shadows, her heart pounding, as the beggar, ragged, stooped his face, weathered by years, stepped forward, his presence a quiet storm in the chaos of the hall. The suitors' laughter, cruel and mocking, filled the air. As the old man took the bow, their jeers a chorus of disdain for the frail stranger who dared to touch a king's weapon. "Look at the beggar." Antinous sneered, his voice dripping with contempt, thinking he can play at being Odysseus. The others joined in their insults, sharp as knives, but the beggar's hands were steady, his movements slow but deliberate, as if the bow itself recognized its master. Telemachus, standing near his jaw, set with a fire that mirrored his father's, silenced the crowd with a sharp command, his eyes locked on the beggar with a knowing intensity. Penelope, her breath held, felt a tremor of suspicion, a spark of something impossible stirring in her chest. The hall grew quiet, the air heavy with anticipation, as the beggar ran his fingers along the bow's polished wood, his touch reverent as if greeting an old friend. The suitors, blind to the shift, continued their mockery, unaware that the moment they had dreaded, the return of Ithaca's king, was unfolding before them. The beggar, his disguise crafted by Athena's divine hand, lifted the bow, its weight familiar despite the years. His fingers, calloused from battles and storms, traced the string, testing its tension with a quiet confidence. The hall, once loud with derision, fell into a stunned silence, the suitors' laughter dying as they sensed a change, a ripple of power they could not name. He bent the bow, his movements fluid, the string yielding, as if it had waited for this moment. The act was effortless, a dance of muscle and memory, the bow bending to the will of the man who had crafted it, who had strung it in this very hall decades ago. The suitors' faces paled, their eyes wide with disbelief as the beggar notched an arrow, his gaze steady, his hands unerring. The axes gleamed in the torchlight, their rings a narrow path that demanded perfection. He drew the string, his breath slow, his heart a drumbeat of purpose. The arrow flew a streak of bronze and feather, threading the rings with a precision that seemed to defy the gods, its path, a straight line that pierced the silence and struck the heart of Ithaca's chaos. A gasp rose from the hall, the suitors frozen, their mockery replaced by a dawning fear. Penelope's hands clutched her robe, her eyes locked on the beggar, her mind racing with a hope too fragile to voice. Telemachus, his fists clenched, stepped closer, his body taut with readiness. The beggar lowered the bow, his eyes lifting to meet the suitors, and in that moment the disguise began to fray, not in form, but in presence. The air crackled with the weight of revelation, the hall a stage where the past and present collided. The suitors, their confidence shattered, shifted uneasily, their hands reaching for weapons they did not yet dare to draw. Antinous, his voice trembling, demanded to know who this stranger was, but the beggar's silence was an answer, a promise of reckoning. The arrow, still quivering in its target, was more than a feat. It was a declaration, a signal that the king they had mocked, the husband they had dismissed, the father they had forgotten, was among them once more. Odysseus, still cloaked in the beggar's guise, felt the weight of 20 years lift, if only for a moment. The bow his bow had sung true its string, a chord that resonated with the heart of Ithaca. He had tested the suitors' weakness, their arrogance, their unworthiness, and now he stood on the edge of revelation. Penelope, her eyes glistening, took a step forward, her voice soft but commanding, as she declared the challenge met. The suitors, their faces a mix of rage and fear, began to murmur their unity, fracturing, as they realized the beggar was no ordinary man. Telemachus, his hand on his sword, moved to his father's side, his loyalty a shield against the storm to come. The hall, its walls echoing with the memory of feasts and laughter, stood poised for blood, its air thick with the tension of a kingdom on the brink. The arrow's flight was a spark igniting the fire of Odysseus's return. The suitors, blind to the truth, had failed not just the bow, but the legacy of the man who had built this palace, who had loved its queen, who had fathered its prince. Athena, unseen but ever present, watched with pride her plan unfolding as the hero prepared to shed his disguise. The challenge, Penelope's cunning gift, had been a stage for this moment, a test that only Odysseus could pass. The hall, its silence a prelude to chaos, waited for the king to reclaim his place, to turn the suitors' greed into their undoing. The bow, still warm in his hands, was a promise kept, a vow to restore the home he had fought for across seas and years. Ithaca, its heart battered, but unbroken, stood ready for its king's return, the arrow's path a line drawn between exile and redemption. Instantly, Odysseus shed his disguise, and together with his son, he turned the great hall into a bloodbath, punishing all those who had violated his home, his voice a thunderclap of righteous fury that shattered the suitors' arrogance and restored the order of Ithaca's heart. The hall, its air thick with the echo of the arrow's perfect flight, stood frozen in the wake of the beggar's triumph. The suitors, their faces pale with disbelief, clutched their goblets, their laughter silenced, as the old man straightened his stooped frame, unfolding into the stature of a king. Athena's magic fell away like a veil, revealing Odysseus, his eyes blazing with 20 years of pent-up wrath, his scars, a map of trials endured his presence, a storm that filled the room. The bow, still warm in his hands, was no longer a relic, but a weapon, its string taut with the promise of justice. Telemachus, his son, stepped to his side, his sword drawn, his face a mirror of his father's resolve. The suitors, their greed exposed, their power crumbling, scrambled for weapons. But the hall, once their playground, was now a battlefield, its walls bearing witness to the return of Ithaca's king. Odysseus's voice, deep and commanding, rang out, naming himself Odysseus, son of Laertes, king of Ithaca, returned to reclaim what is mine. The suitors recoiled, their eyes wide with terror, as the truth struck like a blade. Antinous, their leader, tried to rally them, his voice shrill with defiance, but Odysseus raised the bow, his hand steady, and loosed an arrow that pierced Antinous's throat. his blood spilling across the table where he had feasted on stolen wealth. The hall erupted into chaos, the suitors shouting their hands, fumbling for swords and spears. But Odysseus and Telemachus moved as one, their strikes precise, their fury unrelenting. Eumaeus, the loyal swineherd, and Philoetius, the cowherd, joined them, their hearts kindled by the sight of their king, their weapons drawn to defend the home they had guarded in his absence. The suitors, over 100 strong, were many, but their greed had made them soft, their arrogance a chain that bound them to their fate. The battle was swift and brutal, the hall transformed into a slaughterhouse. Odysseus, his strength honed by years of survival, fought with the ferocity of a lion, his arrows finding their marks with deadly precision. Telemachus, young but fierce, struck down suitors with a sword that sang of his father's bloodline, his movements a blend of instinct and the lessons Odysseus had whispered in their secret councils. The suitors, their bravado shattered, fell one by one. Eurymachus, his charm useless, crumpled under a spear. Amphinomus, who had once shown kindness, met the same fate, his betrayal sealed by his presence among the guilty. The floor, once polished stone, ran red with blood, the air thick with the cries of the dying and the clash of bronze. Penelope, watching from the upper chambers, her heart torn between hope and fear, heard the chaos, her hands clutching the loom that had been her shield for so long. She dared not descend, not yet, her mind wrestling with the possibility that the beggar was indeed her husband, returned to reclaim their home. The loyal servants fought with a fury born of years of humiliation. Eumaeus, his face grim, drove a spear through a suitor who had mocked him, his loyalty to Odysseus a fire that burned brighter than ever. Eurycleia, the nursemaid, barred the doors, trapping the suitors within her hands, steady despite her age. The hall, once a place of feasting, became a tomb for those who had violated its sanctity. Odysseus, his eyes never leaving the fray, called out orders, his voice a beacon through the chaos, guiding his small band against the suitors' numbers. Athena, unseen but present, lent her divine strength, her aegis, a subtle shield that turned aside errant blows, ensuring the king's victory. The suitors, their weapons no match for a hero forged by gods and trials, fell like wheat before a scythe, their greed and treachery repaid in blood. As the last suitor fell, the hall grew still, the silence heavy with the weight of justice. Odysseus, his chest heaving, his hands stained with blood, surveyed the carnage tables, overturned goblets, shattered bodies strewn across the floor. The suitors who had consumed his wealth mocked his name, and pressed his wife lay dead, their ambitions dust. Telemachus, his face flushed with battle, stood at his father's side, his eyes bright with pride and relief. Eumaeus and Philoetius, their weapons lowered, bowed to their king, their loyalty rewarded in this moment of triumph. Yet Odysseus's heart was not at peace. The hall, though cleansed, was not yet home. Penelope, the anchor of his soul, remained apart, her trust a prize he had yet to win. He ordered the hall cleaned, the bodies removed, the blood scrubbed from the stone. Eurycleia, her hands trembling, obeyed, her eyes meeting his with a recognition that needed no words. The battle had been won, but the war was not over. Odysseus, his disguise gone, stood as a king, but the weight of 20 years, years of loss, of longing, of trials, hung heavy. He thought of Penelope, her cunning, and her strength, and knew she would not accept him without proof, her heart guarded by years of hope and doubt. The suitor's blood had cleansed the hall, but it was her love, her trust, that would restore the home he had fought for. Telemachus, his son, stood ready to follow his loyalty, a bridge between the past and the future. The hall, its air now clear of the suitor's stench, waited for the final act, the reunion that would heal the wounds of 2 decades. Odysseus, His eyes lifting to the upper chambers felt the pull of Penelope's presence, a call stronger than any sea or storm. Finally, after one last test regarding their unmovable bed, Penelope recognized her husband, and 20 years of separation ended in a tearful reunion, a testament to the endurance of love and the longing for home. The great hall of Ithaca's palace now silent after the bloodbath, its air cleansed of the suitor's greed, but heavy with the weight of a kingdom restored. The bodies had been cleared, the blood scrubbed from the stone, the chaos of battle replaced by an uneasy stillness, as Odysseus stood no longer a beggar or a wanderer, but a king reclaiming his place. His eyes, weathered by years of storms and trials, lifted to the upper chambers where Penelope waited her heart, a fortress guarded by doubt and hope. The suitors were gone, their arrogance silenced by his bow, but the final trial lay not in combat, but in love, in proving to the woman who had held Ithaca together that he was truly her husband, returned after 2 decades of absence. Telemachus, his son, stood at his side, his face flushed with the pride of their victory. Yet his eyes followed his father's gaze, knowing the reunion with his mother was the true restoration of their home. Odysseus, his heart pounding, moved toward the stairs, each step a journey toward the woman who had been his beacon through every trial, his reason for defying gods and monsters. Penelope descended her steps, slow, her bearing regal, despite the weariness etched into her face. The hall, lit by flickering torches, seemed to hold its breath as she faced the man who claimed to be Odysseus. Her eyes, sharp with the cunning that had outwitted the suitors, studied him. His weathered features, his scarred hands, the fire in his gaze that echoed the man she had loved. Yet 20 years had taught her caution. Too many tales of false heroes, too many nights of grief had hardened her trust. She stood before him, her voice steady but distant, questioning his identity, probing for proof that this was no trick of the gods or some cruel impostor. The servants, Euryclea, Eumaeus, Philoetius, watched in silence their loyalty to their king and queen, a quiet strength in the room. Odysseus, his heart aching at her reserve, spoke of their past, of battles and promises of the love that had sustained him through seas and storms. But Penelope, her mind as sharp as his, needed more than words. She needed a sign that only Odysseus, her true husband, could know. She turned to Euryclea, her voice calm but deliberate, and ordered the great bed of their marriage chamber brought to the hall for the stranger to sleep on. Odysseus's eyes widened, his breath catching, for he alone knew the secret of that bed, one post carved from a living olive tree rooted in the earth, unmovable, a symbol of their unbreakable bond. "Who could move our bed?" he demanded, his voice rising with a mix of anger and pain. "Its post is a tree, its roots deep in the ground, crafted by my own hands." The words, raw and unguarded, broke the dam of Penelope's doubt. Her eyes, glistening with tears, met his, and in that moment the years fell away. She saw not the weathered wanderer, but the man who had built their home, who had carved their bed, who had promised to return no matter the cost. She stepped forward, her hands trembling as she touched his face, her fingers tracing the lines of a life she had dreamed of every night. "Odysseus," she whispered, her voice breaking, and the hall seemed to sigh with relief, its walls echoing the reunion of a king and queen. They fell into each other's arms, their tears mingling their embrace, a bridge across 20 years of separation. The hall, once a battlefield, became a sanctuary, its air filled with the quiet sobs of a love that had endured against all odds. Telemachus, watching, felt his own heart swell, the father he had known only through stories, now real, his mother's strength rewarded at last. Euryclea, her eyes wet, smiled, her hands clasped as if in prayer, while Eumaeus and Philoetius stood guard their loyalty, a shield around this sacred moment. Odysseus held Penelope, his arms strong, despite the years, his voice murmuring her name like a prayer. He spoke of the seas that had tried to drown him, the gods who had tested him, the nights he had lain awake on Calypso's island, her face his only anchor. Penelope, her voice soft, told of her own battles, the suitor's greed, the endless weaving and unweaving, the hope she had clung to despite the silence of years. Their words wove a tapestry of shared suffering, of love that had defied time and fate, of a home that had waited for this moment. The bed, unmovable as their bond, stood as a testament to their reunion, its olive tree roots a symbol of the life they had built together. Odysseus, his heart full, spoke of their future, of rebuilding Ithaca, of teaching Telemachus the ways of a king. Penelope, her cunning now softened by joy, promised to stand at his side, her wisdom a partner to his strength. The hall, its scars hidden in the torchlight, seemed to breathe again, its spirit restored by the return of its heart. The suitor's blood had cleansed it, but it was this reunion, this love, that made it a home once more. The gods, watching from Olympus, saw the balance restored. Athena, her pride quiet but fierce, Zeus, his decree fulfilled, even Poseidon, his wrath spent, turning his gaze to other seas. Ithaca, battered but unbroken, stood whole again. Its king and queen reunited, its prince ready to carry their legacy forward. As dawn broke, painting the cliffs of Ithaca in gold, Odysseus and Penelope walked hand in hand to their chamber, the bed waiting, as it always had, its roots deep in the earth. They lay together, their bodies fitting as if no time had passed, their whispers a vow to face whatever trials remained. The island, its air sweet with olive and salt, seemed to sing of their return, its people stirring with news of the king's victory. Telemachus, standing on the cliffs, looked to the sea, no longer a threat, but a path his father had conquered. The journey begun 20 years ago in the fires of Troy ended here in the quiet of a love that had endured storms, gods, and time itself. Odysseus, the man of many ways, was home, his heart at peace, his kingdom restored, his story, a testament to the power of love and the pull of home. And so, dear friends, we leave Ithaca restored as Odysseus's heart finds home. The seas grow still, their storms no match for the fire of love and loyalty. Penelope's embrace holds strong, a beacon after years of trials. The island sighs, its king returned. Thank you for joining us on Sleep Stories TV. If you loved this tale, subscribe and hit the bell. Share your thoughts below. What would you endure for home? Until next time, let the stars guide your dreams.